My name is Sophia, I'm 27, and I am a captain in the United States Army Special Forces. I've been trained to face enemies in the harshest conditions imaginable, but nothing could have prepared me for the pain of discovering my father and stepmother rummaging through my late mother's lockbox in our family home. The betrayal cut even deeper when I overheard them discussing a plan to force me to share my inheritance with my step-siblings. My mother left me a significant sum, protected in a trust, until I turned 25. It was her escape route for me. Now, they wanted to take what was rightfully mine. If you have ever experienced betrayal from your own family over money, let me know where you're watching from. Subscribe to this channel and like this video if you've ever had to defend what was yours from the very people who were supposed to protect you. The sound from upstairs was faint at first, a muffled scraping that didn't belong in the quiet afternoon of my childhood home. But it was the voices that froze me at the bottom of the stairs, my hand hovering over the banister. It was my father, William, and his wife, Vanessa. Their words, laced with a casual greed that made my stomach clench, drifted down the stairwell. They were talking about the trust, my trust. They were planning how to convince me that sharing my mother's legacy was the right thing to do. My training took over. Confrontation would be a tactical mistake. It would reveal my intelligence and surrender the element of surprise. My breath evened out. My pulse slowed. I was no longer a daughter in her family home. I was an operator in a hostile environment. I backed away from the stairs, my boots making no sound on the hardwood floor. I moved like a ghost through the house I grew up in, slipping out the back door onto the porch. The cold November air of Fayetteville, North Carolina, hit my face, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. The initial shock, that raw, gut-wrenching pain of betrayal, quickly receded, replaced by a terrifying clarity. This wasn't a family dispute. This was an enemy campaign, and I was the target. I pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, but to open a note. I logged the date, the time, and the exact words I'd overheard. Data is ammunition. A few minutes later, the back door slid open. William and Vanessa stepped out, their faces arranged in masks of placid innocence. "Oh, there you are, sweetie," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that was nauseating. "Your father and I were just sorting through some of your mom's old papers. So many memories." The lie was so blatant it almost made me laugh. That lockbox didn't just contain papers, it held the last tangible pieces of my mother. The stack of letters she wrote me every week I was at basic training, the small silver locket she gave me before my first deployment, and the worn photograph of the two of us at Myrtle Beach, smiling, a lifetime ago. The violation felt physical. My father just nodded, his eyes scanning me. It wasn't a look of concern, it was an assessment. "You're home without any warning. Everything okay?" he asked. He wasn't asking about my well-being. He was evaluating the status of the asset. I held his gaze, my face a carefully constructed neutral plane. "I'm fine, just tired," I said. It was my poker face, a survival skill I'd honed in interrogation training, and, as it turned out, at my own family's kitchen table. Later that evening, the battlefield shifted to the Thanksgiving dinner table. The air was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and the unspoken tension. Vanessa launched the first probing attack, her words casual but precisely aimed. She lamented how expensive tuition at Duke University was for her son, then sighed dramatically about the down payment her daughter, Grace, needed for her new marital home. "If only our family had some kind of unexpected financial cushion," she said, her eyes flicking towards me for just a second. William picked up the assist without missing a beat. "Family is supposed to help each other out, Sophia. Your mother always believed in that." They were weaponizing my mother's memory, twisting her generosity into a tool for emotional blackmail. They were planting the seeds of guilt, hoping they would take root in a daughter's sense of duty. The injustice of it was a bitter taste in my mouth, worse than any overcooked Brussels sprout on my plate. I could feel the invisible walls of the room closing in, the same way they had my entire childhood. I didn't argue. I didn't engage. I just continued to cut my piece of turkey, my movements deliberate and controlled. I ate every bite, my silence a fortress they couldn't breach. When I was finished, I stood and collected my plate. My movements were calm, measured, but as I passed behind my father's chair, I stopped. I looked directly at him, my voice perfectly level, devoid of the rage simmering beneath the surface. Mom's estate is between me and her attorney, I said, each word a carefully placed stone, building a wall between us. I'll handle it. The statement, though quiet, was a declaration of war. It drew a line in the sand so clear that even they couldn't pretend not to see it. Vanessa's fake smile faltered. My father's jaw tightened. That night, back in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by faded posters and dusty track and field trophies, sleep was impossible. The room felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. The little girl who had once sought her father's approval was gone. In her place was a soldier, a survivor. I sat on the edge of the bed, the glow of my phone the only light in the room. Then, I made a decision. I walked over to the desk, opened my laptop, and the screen bathed my face in a cool blue light. In the search bar, I typed the words, Inheritance Dispute Lawyers, Charlotte, North Carolina. The battle had been joined. I was preparing for war. After my father and Vanessa retreated inside, I stayed on the porch, my laptop still open on my lap, the list of lawyers glowing in the dark. My eyes drifted to the upstairs window of what used to be my mother's office. I could still see the faint outline of her desk against the glass. The image of them rifling through her lockbox, their hands on her things, triggered a memory, sharp and painful. From a lifetime ago. I was 14. I had just won first place at the county science fair for a project on renewable energy that I'd poured my heart into for months. I came home clutching a gaudy, gold-colored trophy, my chest swelling with a pride I couldn't contain. I expected a smile, maybe even a good job. Instead, my father, William, saw the trophy and his face darkened. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. "I won, Dad. First place." He snatched it from my hands. "You won. You wasted weeks on this useless nonsense instead of helping around the house, and you call that winning?" Before I could process his words, he drew his arm back and hurled the trophy against the living room wall. It shattered on impact, the plastic eagle snapping off, the fake marble base cracking in two. The sound of it breaking was the sound of my heart splintering. Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent. I wasn't just crying for the broken prize, I was crying from the crushing injustice of it all. My success, something I had worked so hard for, had become a reason for punishment. He pointed a finger at me, his face red with a rage I would never understand. "Don't you dare cry in my house. Weakness is not welcome here." Later that night, my mother, Elaine, found me in my room, staring at the broken pieces of the trophy I'd gathered from the floor. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me it would be okay. My mother wasn't built that way. She was a lawyer, precise and logical, but with a fierce, quiet love that was my anchor. She sat beside me on the bed and placed a small leather-bound book in my hands. It was old, the pages worn and soft to the touch. The gold lettering on the cover read, Meditations. "His name is Marcus Aurelius," she said, her voice a calm counterpoint to the storm that had just passed. "He was a Roman emperor, a general who led armies, and a philosopher who commanded his own mind. He teaches us that you cannot control what others do to you, but you can always, always control how you react." She gently tapped my temple with her finger. "Your real strength is in here, Sophia. It's the one thing no one can ever take from you. Not him. Not anyone. Don't you ever let them." In that moment, she didn't just give me a book. She gave me a shield. She gave me a weapon forged not of steel, but of intellect and resilience. She gave me the philosophy of stoicism, the creed of a warrior. That night was a turning point, and as I grew older, I watched my mother live by that creed. I remember the final years of her illness. Cancer withered her body, leaving her frail, but it never touched her mind. Her eyes remained as sharp and clear as ever. I'd come home from college on weekends and find her at her desk for hours, surrounded by legal documents, on the phone with attorneys. I thought she was settling her own affairs. I was wrong. She wasn't preparing to die, she was preparing me to live. She was building a fortress. A legal fortress around the assets she had earned, brick by painstaking brick. One afternoon, when she was tired, she explained it to me in a rare moment of vulnerability. "This isn't about the money, Sophia," she said, her voice thin but firm as she gestured to the stacks of paper. "This is freedom. This is years of your life where he can't control you, can't hold anything over your head. This is your ammunition for a future war you might have to fight." She looked at me, her gaze piercing. "I won't be there to fight it for you." She knew. Somehow she knew the kind of man my father truly was, and she knew that one day he would come for what was mine. My mother, the warrior, was arming her daughter for a battle she herself would never see. The sheer force of that love, that foresight, still takes my breath away. It was the ultimate act of protection. Back in the present, sitting in the cold North Carolina night, I finally closed my laptop. I went back inside, up to my room, and pulled that same leather-bound book from my nightstand. The cover was even more worn now, the spine soft from years of use. I opened it, and my eyes immediately fell upon a passage she had underlined in pencil all those years ago. "The obstacle in the path becomes the path." Reading those words, the rage and the pain inside me settled into something else, something hard and clear, a purpose. This betrayal, this ugly grab for money by my father and his wife, it wasn't just an obstacle, it was a test. It was the war my mother had prepared me for. This was my path to fulfilling the promise I had made to her in the quiet of her hospital room, that I would live a life that was fully and unapologetically my own. I was no longer fighting just for a trust fund. I was fighting to defend the legacy of another warrior, my mother. And I would not fail her. I sat there in my childhood room, the warrior's creed from my mother echoing in my mind. My gaze drifted from the dusty academic awards on my shelf to the crisp Army Green Service uniform hanging on my closet door. The two seemed to belong to different people, from different worlds. But they weren't. They were both part of a long, lonely war I had been fighting for years. My mind went back to the sweltering heat of Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Basic training. I remember the relentless sun, the sand that got into everything, and the constant deafening roar of the drill sergeants' voices. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. Every day was a test of survival. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the profound loneliness. Mail call was the worst part of the day. I'd watch the other recruits in my platoon, their faces lighting up as they tore open letters from home, reading words of encouragement from parents, siblings, and sweethearts. They would read passages aloud, sharing stories and showing pictures. And every day, when the sergeant called out the last name, mine was never among them. My mailbox remained empty. A small metal box of nothing that somehow felt heavier than the rucksack I carried all day. Then came the day we were finally allowed our first phone call. I waited in line for over an hour, my heart pounding with a desperate, childish hope. I just wanted to hear a kind word, a simple, "We're proud of you, keep going." I dialed my father's number, my hands trembling. He answered, and for a moment, it sounded normal. "Sophia, how are you?" "I'm good, Dad. It's tough, but I'm making it." "That's good to hear," he said, his tone detached. There was an awkward pause, and then he asked the question that shattered what little hope I had left. "Listen, while I have you on the phone, has the Army settled your mother's death benefit paperwork yet?" The world went silent. The chatter of the other recruits, the sounds of the base, it all faded away. In that moment, I understood. I wasn't his daughter calling from a war zone in training. I was a loose end in a financial transaction. A wave of cold, bitter clarity washed over me. I was completely and utterly on my own. I mumbled something about having to go and hung up the phone. I didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. Something inside me had hardened, turned to steel. That bitterness didn't break me. It became my fuel. From that day on, I pushed myself with a ferocity that bordered on madness. I wasn't just trying to pass, I was trying to obliterate every standard. I was the first one up in the morning and the last one to stop during physical training. I became the only woman in my company to max out the Army physical fitness test. During the long, grueling ruck marches, when I'd see the big, tough men around me starting to falter, I would just grit my teeth and keep going. I wasn't doing it to impress them or the drill sergeants. I was doing it to prove to myself over and over that I didn't need their approval. I didn't need anyone's. I could carry my own weight no matter how heavy it was. After basic training, I didn't choose the easy path. I volunteered for the Special Forces Assessment and Selection. The path to becoming a Green Beret is one of the most brutal in the U.S. military, designed to break you physically, mentally, and emotionally. I chose it because it was the hardest thing I could find. I faced skepticism from some of the male candidates, the unspoken belief that a woman didn't belong there. I never argued with them, I just outran them, outshot them, and outlasted them. The Q course was hell on earth. Weeks of sleep deprivation, complex problem solving under extreme duress, and constant evaluation where the failure rate is astronomical. But I kept going, driven by my mother's memory and the cold echo of my father's voice. The day I graduated, when they placed that green beret on my head, was one of the proudest moments of my life. I stood there, alone in the crowd of cheering families. I didn't make a phone call home. There was no one to call. If you've ever had a moment where you had to be your own cheerleader because no one else was there for you, please support this story by liking this video and prove you're a survivor by commenting with the single word, warrior. Back in my room, looking at the uniform that had cost me so much sweat and heartache, I finally understood. All those years of isolation, of fighting on a lonely battlefield, that was my real training. My father and Vanessa, they thought they were dealing with the 27-year-old girl who had just come home for the holidays. They were wrong. They were facing a special forces captain who was accustomed to fighting alone in hostile territory. The shock had worn off. The pain had been filed away. Now, only the mission remained. I said the words aloud to the quiet room, a cold resolve settling deep in my bones. I survived hell in the Q course. I can sure as hell survive this. My determination was forged. The next phase of the operation was about to begin. The cold resolve I'd felt in my bedroom began to fray around the edges as the night wore on. Determination is one thing, but the sheer weight of the fight ahead felt immense, a solitary burden in the suffocating silence of the house. I was an army of one, and the enemy knew the terrain of my heart better than anyone. Staring at the ceiling, the memory of that Thanksgiving dinner, thick with unspoken threats and feigned affection, replayed in my mind. But then, another memory surfaced, pushing the toxic one aside like a clean, strong wind. It was from just a few days earlier, my real Thanksgiving. It wasn't in a pristine dining room with polished silver and crystal glasses. It was in a loud, boisterous corner of Mac's Speed Shop, a legendary BBQ joint off Bragg Boulevard that always smelled of smoked pork, cheap beer, and freedom. My ODA, my Operational Detachment Alpha Team, was crammed into a scuffed-up wooden booth. There was no roasted turkey, no green bean casserole, no perfectly browned dinner rolls. Just plates piled high with saucy, fall-off-the-bone BBQ ribs, mountains of crinkle-cut fries, and sweating pitchers of Budweiser. The air vibrated with the sound of Leonard Skynyard on the jukebox, booming laughter, and the kind of outrageous, slightly embellished stories that can only be told among soldiers who have seen the world together. My team leader, Master Sergeant John Miller, we all just called him Sarge, raised his beer bottle, the gesture silencing the table more effectively than a command. Sarge was a man carved from granite and 20 years of hard-won wisdom, with more combat experience in his little finger than all the rest of us combined. His voice, a low gravelly sound, cut through the noise of the bar. "All right, listen up," he said. And every man, myself included, leaned in. A toast to the ones who couldn't make it home this year and to the family we've got right here. A chorus of hoo-ah erupted, a deep, resonant sound of agreement as we all clinked bottles. In that moment, surrounded by these men, my brothers in every way that mattered, I felt a sense of belonging so powerful it physically loosened the knot in my chest. This was family. Not the one you're born into by accident of biology, but the one you choose, the one you bleed and fight for. Back in the lonely quiet of my childhood room, that memory was a lifeline. I still had my team. I wasn't entirely alone. I picked up my phone, my thumb hesitating over Sarge's name in my contacts. It felt awkward, unprofessional even, to drag my personal mess into his world. We dealt with life and death, with threats to national security, not petty family squabbles over money. But I was out of options, operating on dangerously low emotional reserves. I hit the call button. He picked up on the second ring, his voice alert. Sophia, everything all right? You're supposed to be on leave, enjoying yourself. I took a deep breath, the air tasting stale. Sarge, I need some advice. Off the record, it's personal. I stumbled through the story, feeling more pathetic and small with every word. I told him about finding them with the lockbox, the conversation I overheard, the predatory nature of the Thanksgiving dinner, the weight of my mother's inheritance. I braced myself for judgment, or maybe just a gruff, "That's above my pay grade, Captain. Handle your business." Instead, he was just silent on the other end of the line. He listened. He truly listened, letting me talk until I had nothing left to say, the whole ugly story laid bare. When I finished, there was a long pause, and I could hear the faint sound of him breathing. Then he spoke, his voice a low, steady rumble that immediately calmed my frayed nerves. "Sophia, listen to me very carefully," he said, his tone deadly serious now. "This is not a family problem. This is a psychological operation, and you are deep in enemy territory. You need support." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, a shudder running through me. He got it. He didn't dismiss it, didn't belittle it. He actually got it. "I've got a guy," he continued, his voice shifting into mission mode. "Former SIGINT guy from group. Smartest damn computer wizard I've ever met. His name is Alex Chen, call sign, Ghost. He owes me a favor. I'm sending you his number right now. You call him, he'll know what to do." "And Captain?" "Yeah, Sarge. We are not letting you fight this alone." We are not letting you fight this alone. 14 words. That's all it took. 14 words of unconditional support that my own father, in 27 years, had never been capable of saying. The gratitude I felt was so overwhelming it was a physical pressure behind my eyes. Before I could even formulate a proper thank you, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was just a string of coordinates. A few seconds later, another text. "Secure line, call when ready." "Gee." I called. A voice on the other end answered. No greeting, just a crisp, efficient, "Go for Chen." Alex Ghost. Chen didn't waste a single second on pleasantries or expressions of sympathy. He was all business, approaching my problem like a target analysis, which was exactly the kind of detached professionalism I needed right now. "Sarge gave me the short version," he said, his voice quick and sharp. "Your father, what's his profession? Financial advisor? Good. Those guys always leave a digital footprint. Stepmother? What's her background? Any priors, bankruptcies, civil suits? Give me their full names, dates of birth, and last known addresses. I'll start the reconnaissance." I gave him the information, feeling a profound sense of relief wash over me. I didn't need a shoulder to cry on. I needed an ally. I needed a fellow soldier who understood the mission was to gather intelligence and prepare the battlefield. And in Sarge and Ghost, I had found them. After the calls, I felt a fundamental shift inside me. The feeling of being a lone operator, isolated and outgunned, was gone. It was replaced by the quiet, unshakable confidence that comes from knowing you have a team watching your back. My real family. The ones who understood loyalty, honor, and the unbreakable code of never leaving a comrade behind. They didn't care about my money. They cared about me. The contrast between their immediate, unquestioning support and my own family's calculated greed was a harsh and painful light. But it illuminated the truth and solidified my resolve. This fight was no longer just about me, or even just about my mother's legacy. It was about honoring the trust my brothers had placed in me. And for them, I would be unbreachable, I would be unbreakable. I would win. After my calls with Sarge and Ghost, a fragile sense of control settled over me. I had a team. I had a plan. But the enemy rarely sticks to your timetable. The silence from my father and Vanessa lasted exactly 3 days. It was the calm before a multi-front assault. The first attack came from the flank, disguised as a white flag. A text message from my youngest stepsister, Jacob, who was 18. Hey, Sophia, are you free to talk? There's something I need to tell you. Of all of Vanessa's children, Jacob was the one I felt a flicker of hope for. He was quiet, seemingly kind, and mostly stayed out of the family's toxic dynamics. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a Starbucks off the All-American Freeway. My training screamed that it was a trap, but a small, foolish part of me hoped I was wrong. I wasn't. He sat across from me, looking genuinely distressed, nervously stirring a frappuccino that was already mostly melted. He told me how stressed his mom and my dad were, how the tension in the house was unbearable. He talked about financial struggles, about how hard they were trying to keep the family afloat. Then came the payload, delivered with practiced sincerity. Mom says, she says you just don't understand, he mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes. You have everything, Sophia. Your career, your mom's money. We don't. A little help from you would change everything for us. I felt a cold wave of disappointment wash over me. He wasn't being malicious. He was just weak. A pawn. Every word he spoke was a carefully crafted talking point straight from Vanessa's playbook. She had sent her youngest, most sympathetic child as a human guilt trip, a classic psychological tactic designed to soften the target and breach their defenses. I looked at this boy, who was parroting his mother's greed, and I felt a profound sense of pity. I paid for his coffee and left, offering only a non-committal, "I'll think about it, Jacob." When the emotional gambit failed, my father escalated to a full frontal assault. He called me the next day, and there was no pretense of fatherly concern in his voice. It was pure, unfiltered rage. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he bellowed into the phone, his voice distorted with fury. "Setting conditions for me, in my own family? I am your father." I held the phone slightly away from my ear, my own emotions locked down, my voice steady. "This isn't about that, and you know it." "I can make your life very difficult, you ungrateful brat," he shouted. "I'll call your commanding officer. I'll tell him I have a delinquent daughter who refuses her family responsibilities. We'll see how the army likes that." The threat was so absurd, so impotent, that it was almost laughable. He had no concept of the military chain of command or my life outside his sphere of influence, but it revealed his desperation. He was falling back on the old patriarchal power plays that had worked when I was a child. He still thought he could control me through intimidation and shame. The rage that had been simmering inside me since Thanksgiving flared hot, but I channeled it into ice. "Go ahead," I said, my voice flat and cold as a surgeon's scalpel. "Feel free, and just so you're aware, this call is being recorded." The sputtering silence on the other end was deeply satisfying. He hung up. The pressure was mounting, but I wasn't operating blind. That evening, I received an encrypted message from Ghost. It was short and to the point. Bingo. William took a major loss on a crypto investment, deep in debt to a private lender. Vanessa has a prior bankruptcy and a string of credit card lawsuits she settled out of court. They're not just greedy, Captain. They're desperate. This is about survival for them. The information landed like a gut punch, but it changed everything. This wasn't just a grab for a comfortable retirement. This was a frantic attempt to plug a hole in a sinking ship. Their desperation meant they were dangerous. They wouldn't stop. They would do anything. This war wouldn't be won with a conversation or a compromise. It would have to be won with a decisive, overwhelming show of force. The final salvo arrived the next morning, not as a text or a call, but as a sleek, professional email. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, formally requesting my presence at a family mediation session on behalf of their client, William. The subject of the meeting was the equitable distribution of the Elaine Morgan estate. They had formalized it. They had escalated from a family matter to a legal battleground. They had fired the first official shot. I stared at the email on my laptop screen, the polite, corporate language a thin veil for the ugly threat beneath. And in that moment, the anger, the frustration, the exhaustion, it all melted away. All I felt was a cold, hard certainty. I looked out the window of my childhood bedroom at the gray Fayetteville sky, the bare branches of the oak trees like skeletal fingers against the clouds. I asked myself a simple question, the words forming silently in my mind. Haven't I endured enough? And the answer came back, not as a thought, but as a deep, unshakable conviction that resonated in every cell of my body. Yes, more than enough. The email from my father's lawyer was the final confirmation. The battle lines were drawn. But in his spiraling desperation, my father made one last, catastrophic miscalculation. He decided to bring the war to my turf, to the one place on earth I considered sacred ground. I was in my office on post at Fort Bragg, a small functional space that smelled of coffee and clean discipline. I was reviewing after-action reports from a recent training exercise when my desk phone buzzed with an unfamiliar extension. It was the front gate. A sergeant on duty informed me that a civilian named William was requesting a visitor's pass, claiming to be my father with an urgent family matter that required my immediate attention. A cold dread, sharp and metallic, washed over me. He couldn't possibly be that stupid, that arrogant. Oh, but he was. His strategy was as transparent as it was pathetic. He must have thought that by showing up at my place of work, in the heart of the rigidly hierarchical military world, he could leverage his authority as a father to publicly shame me into submission. He thought he could make me feel like a little girl again, small and powerless in front of my peers and superiors. What he failed to comprehend, in his stunning ignorance, was that this wasn't his house. This was my house. This was the one place on the planet where I wasn't just a daughter, I was Captain Sophia, United States Army. And here, I had the definitive home field advantage. By the time I walked from my building to my company headquarters, he was already there, sitting in Sarge Miller's office. I paused outside the open door, composing my features into a neutral mask, and I listened. My father, I realized with a sudden, chilling clarity, was a far better actor than I had ever given him credit for. "And I'm just so worried about her, Master Sergeant," I heard him say, his voice thick with a counterfeit emotion that made my skin crawl. "She's been through so much, with her mother's passing and her deployments. I'm afraid these painful memories are causing her to make unwise financial decisions. The family just wants to help her manage things, to protect her from herself." I stepped into the doorway, and the performance stopped mid-sentence. My father was in a civilian suit that looked painfully out of place amidst the olive drab and camouflage of the office. Across the government-issue metal desk, Sarge sat perfectly still, his large, capable hands folded neatly on the blotter. He hadn't said a word. He just stared at my father with a pair of cold, steel-gray eyes that could freeze hell over. His silence was a fortress, a powerful, unspoken declaration of loyalty that my father, blinded by his own agenda, was too self-absorbed to notice. He saw Sarge not as my trusted team leader and brother-in-arms, but as a captive audience for his pathetic play. I entered the room, the heels of my boots making a sharp, authoritative sound on the polished linoleum floor. I was in my full operational camouflage pattern uniform, the rank on my chest and the Special Forces tab on my shoulder clear for all to see. My father's performance faltered as he saw me. He stood up, a reflexive attempt to reclaim some semblance of parental authority. "Sophia, thank goodness. I was just explaining the delicate situation to your—" I didn't look at him with fear or even the hot rage he deserved. For the first time, I looked at my father and felt nothing but a profound, weary pity. This desperate, manipulative man, performing for a stranger, was all that was left of the father I'd once tried so desperately to please. "William," I said. I didn't call him Dad. The name felt foreign and false in my mouth. My voice was clear and steady, cutting through the thick tension in the room. It didn't tremble, not even for a second. "This is my place of work. These people," I said, gesturing slightly towards Sarge, "are my family. You have just crossed the final, unforgivable line." I turned my head slightly to address my team leader, my voice shifting into the formal, respectful tone of a subordinate addressing a superior officer. Master Sergeant Miller, this man has no official business on a secure military installation. I am requesting that you have him escorted off post. Sarge gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the confirmation I needed. His trust in me was absolute. Then I turned my full attention back to William. I looked him directly in the eye, letting him see the absolute absence of the frightened little girl he thought he could still control. Any and all future communication from you or Vanessa will go through my lawyer, I stated, each word a final, unbreakable command. Do not come here again. Do not call me again. We are done. The color drained from his face. His carefully constructed facade of the concerned father crumbled into dust, revealing the stunned, humiliated man underneath. He looked from my unwavering gaze to Sarge's stony, unreadable expression, and finally understood. He had lost. He'd walked into my world, played by his rules, and my world had utterly rejected him. He stammered something incoherent, a jumble of useless words, grabbed his briefcase, and practically fled from the office like a beaten dog. The heavy office door clicked shut behind him, and the silence he left behind was deafening. I stood there, not moving, just breathing. A weight I had been carrying on my shoulders for 27 years, a crushing, invisible burden of expectation and disappointment, simply lifted. It wasn't a victory that made me want to cheer. It was a release, a profound, fundamental liberation. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I had simply drawn a boundary, not with pleas or arguments, but with the strength and authority I had earned with my own sweat, blood, and tears. If you've ever had to draw a hard line like that to protect your own peace, please show your support by liking this video. And if you believe in the power of setting boundaries, let me know I'm not alone by commenting with one word: freedom. Sarge finally moved. He stood up, walked around his desk, and stopped in front of me. He didn't offer a hug or a comforting word. That wasn't his way. He just looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated professional respect and gave another single, firm nod. Good job, Captain, he said, his voice quiet but firm as oak. You handled that. Now, go find a good lawyer. The real fight is about to begin. Sarge's words, "The real fight is about to begin," echoed in my head as I drove away from Fort Bragg. He was right. The confrontation in his office was just a skirmish. The legal demand for mediation was the opening salvo of the main battle. And I knew I couldn't win a legal war with military tactics alone. I needed a different kind of warrior. I didn't look for a lawyer in Fayetteville. My father had lived and worked there for 30 years. His network of friends and colleagues was woven into the fabric of the town. I needed a complete outsider, someone with no local ties and no reason to play nice. So, I drove the 3 hours to Charlotte, to the gleaming glass towers of the city's financial district. I was heading to the office of a woman I'd only heard about in whispers, a family law attorney with a legendary reputation and a nickname to match, Catherine Morgan, also known as Cat the Shark. They said she never lost. Her office was on the top floor of the Bank of America Corporate Center, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the entire city. The space was modern, minimalist, and radiated power. Cat Morgan herself was just as formidable. She was sharp, impeccably dressed, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. I sat across from her polished mahogany desk, not as a distraught daughter, but as a military officer briefing a new asset. I didn't cry. I didn't ramble. I laid out the situation like a mission report. Ma'am, here's the situation, I began, pushing a thin folder across the desk. The primary objective is to protect my inheritance as stipulated in my mother's final will and testament. The opposing forces are my father, William, and my stepmother, Vanessa. The immediate threat is a legal request for mediation to redistribute the estate's assets. This folder contains the initial intelligence I've gathered, including dates, times, and direct quotes from conversations. I paused, meeting her gaze directly. I'm not here to settle. I am here for a plan of action. A slow smile spread across Cat Morgan's face, a predator's smile. I like your style, Captain, she said, opening the folder. Let's go to war. Kat's first move was to integrate our intelligence operations. She took the information Ghost had already provided and handed it over to a private investigator she kept on retainer, a gruff ex-cop named Malone. For the next week, they worked in the shadows, and the information they unearthed was more damning than I could have imagined. It wasn't just the crypto debt. Malone found the paper trail. They discovered that for years, even when my mother was alive and fighting for her life, William had been siphoning money from their joint accounts. He'd used it to fund a series of high-risk, speculative investments, all without her consent, hiding the losses and covering his tracks. He hadn't just betrayed me, he had been betraying my mother all along. They also dug into Vanessa's past. Her bankruptcy claim from a decade ago was filled with inconsistencies, assets she had conveniently failed to declare. Malone found 2 prior lawsuits for credit card debt that she had settled at the last minute. It painted a clear picture, a long-standing pattern of financial desperation and deceit. Every new piece of evidence Ghost and Malone uncovered felt like another round of ammunition being loaded into a magazine. My arsenal was growing. A week later, I was back in Kat's office. She had dozens of documents spread across her large conference table, like a map of the battlefield. Bank statements, court records, property deeds, sworn affidavits from former business associates of my father. We're not going to just respond to their lawyer's letter, Sophia, Kat said, her voice sharp and decisive. We're not going to defend, we are going to attack. Her strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and aggression. They want a mediation, she said with a humorless laugh. We'll give them one. But before that, we send a little greeting card. The plan was this. Instead of simply refusing William's request, we would draft a legal, cease and desist letter of our own. But this letter would be a targeted strike. It would meticulously outline every single piece of financial misconduct we had uncovered, complete with exhibit numbers referencing the evidence we now possessed. The letter would politely decline their invitation for mediation and strongly suggest that if they pursued any legal action against me whatsoever, I would have no choice but to countersue for financial abuse against my mother's estate and simultaneously forward our findings to the IRS and the state prosecutor's office for potential fraud charges. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a checkmate. We spent the rest of the afternoon crafting the letter. It wasn't written in the dense, dry language of most legal documents. Kat dictated as I typed, and it read like a cold, precise indictment. Section 1. Conspiracy to commit tortious interference with inheritance, referencing the overheard conversation on November 24th. Section 2. A documented history of financial insolvency and fraudulent declarations on the part of Mrs. Vanessa, referencing bankruptcy court filing 708, CR 451. Section 3. Evidence of fiduciary abuse against the late Mrs. Elaine Morgan, referencing unauthorized withdrawals from joint accounts between 2015 and 2018. On and on it went, a systematic dismantling of their entire position. Reading the final draft, I didn't feel rage or vengeful glee. I felt a strange, profound calm. The same calm I felt before a mission, when the planning was done and the objective was clear. This wasn't revenge. This was justice. This was the fortress my mother had started building, and I was just placing the final stones. I looked up at Kat, who was watching me with a satisfied gleam in her eyes. Send it, I said, my voice steady. The operation begins now. The day of the mediation arrived. The meeting was held in a sterile, impersonal conference room at a neutral law firm in downtown Fayetteville. The room was designed to de-escalate conflict, with its beige walls, generic corporate art, and a long polished mahogany table that felt a mile wide. It was the perfect stage for the final act. My father, William, and Vanessa sat on one side of the table with their lawyer, a man with a practiced, sympathetic smile. They looked confident, even smug. I could see it in the way my father leaned back in his chair and Vanessa subtly adjusted her expensive silk scarf. They believed they had me cornered, that they could use the formal setting to pressure me with a combination of legal jargon and emotional appeals to family. They were about to learn how badly they had misjudged their opponent. On my side of the table, there was only me and Kat, the shark, Morgan. I was wearing a simple, sharp navy blue business suit, my posture straight, my hands resting calmly on the table. I felt no fear, no anxiety, just a profound, quiet focus. I had run this scenario through my mind 100 times, anticipating every move, every possible line of attack. I was ready. Their lawyer, a Mr. Davies, cleared his throat and began the proceedings with a warm, patronizing tone. He spoke of the importance of family, of finding common ground, of honoring a mother's presumed wishes for harmony. He talked about familial responsibilities and the moral imperative to support one another. He was painting a picture of me as the cold, unfeeling daughter and them as the concerned, loving family. Kat let him talk. She sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, allowing him to spin his entire narrative without interruption. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally concluded with a hopeful, "So, we trust Sophia will be open to a more equitable arrangement," Kat did not respond to his words. Instead, she simply reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a document nearly 2 inches thick, bound with a sturdy clip. She slid it across the polished table. It glided silently across the wood and came to a stop directly in front of Mr. Davies. The sound it made in the quiet room was as final as a gavel strike. "Before we continue," Kat said, her voice as cold and clear as ice, "I believe you, your clients, and we should all be on the same page regarding the facts. I suggest you review this." Mr. Davies looked confused. He picked up the document. It was our letter. The greeting card. And attached to the back was a thick appendix of exhibits, copies of bank statements, court filings, property records, and sworn statements. Everything. He began to read. Across the table, William and Vanessa exchanged a look of smug curiosity. That look did not last long. As their lawyer flipped through the first few pages, his professional smile vanished, replaced by a slight frown. He flipped another page. The frown deepened. He started reading faster, his eyes darting back and forth across the text. Then he looked up, a flicker of alarm in his eyes, and pushed the document towards my father. "William, I think you need to see this." My father took the document, Vanessa leaning in close to read over his shoulder. I watched them. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. First, the confident facade began to crack. Then, disbelief flickered in their eyes as they saw the first account numbers, the first dates. Then came the visible shock, their faces losing color as they read the details of the bankruptcy fraud, the credit card lawsuits, and finally, pure, unadulterated panic. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth, her face ashen. She looked like she was going to be sick. William's face turned a blotchy red. His hands were trembling as he fumbled with the pages, his eyes wide with the horror of seeing his secret, sordid financial life laid bare in black and white. The numbers didn't lie. The signatures didn't lie. Their entire lives of deceit right there on the table. They were utterly and completely disarmed. Their smug alliance of greed dissolved into panicked, accusatory glances at each other right before my eyes. This is an invasion of privacy, slander. William stammered, looking at his lawyer, desperate for a defense. Mr. Davies, however, was no longer looking at him. He was looking at me, and then at Kat, with the dawning realization that he had walked into an ambush armed with nothing but a few hollow platitudes. He slowly closed the document. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, my chair making no sound. I looked across the table, not at my father's lawyer, not at Vanessa, but directly at William. It was the last time I would ever truly look at him. "This meeting is over," I said. My voice wasn't that of a daughter. It was the voice of a judge delivering a verdict. "Here is what is going to happen now. You will drop this ridiculous claim. You will go back to your lives, and I will go back to mine." I let the words hang in the air for a moment. If I ever receive another phone call, another text message, another letter, or any form of contact from either of you for the rest of my life, this entire file, I gestured to the thick document on the table, will be forwarded to the Internal Revenue Service and the North Carolina State Attorney's Office. I will let them sort out the details of your financial arrangements. I looked from his terrified face to Vanessa's. You will never hear from me again. And I never want to hear from you. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. I turned my back on them, on all of it. Kat Morgan stood with me, and together we walked out of the conference room, leaving William and Vanessa sitting in stunned silence, surrounded by the wreckage of the pathetic little empire they had tried to build on my mother's grave. As Kat and I walked out of the law firm and into the bright Carolina sunshine, I expected to feel a surge of triumph, a rush of victorious adrenaline. But it never came. Instead, as I got into my car and drove away, a strange and hollow emptiness settled in my chest. I had won, decisively. But the victory felt quiet. The cost of this war was the final, official acknowledgement that the family I once had, however broken and dysfunctional, was now gone forever. An amputation had taken place. Necessary, yes, but it still left a phantom limb that ached. Instead of driving back to the house, I found myself heading west, towards Lake Rim Park. It was a place my mother used to take me when I was a little girl. A quiet sanctuary where we'd skip stones and watch the sunlight dapple on the water. I parked the car and walked to the edge of the lake, sitting on a weathered wooden bench beneath a canopy of pine trees. Staring out at the glassy, still surface of the water, I finally let myself feel everything I had been holding back. The immense relief of the weight being lifted, the bone-deep exhaustion from weeks of strategic tension, and beneath it all, a profound and aching grief. It wasn't grief for the man who had just been defeated, but for the father he never was. It was a sadness for the little girl inside me who had spent so many years craving a simple word of pride, a gentle hand on her shoulder, and had received a shattered trophy and a demand for money instead. I sat there for a long time, letting the quiet sorrow wash over me, giving that little girl the space to mourn what she never had. A couple of days later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Jacob. He asked if he could see me one last time before I left town, to talk. I hesitated, but agreed to meet him at a small, independent coffee shop downtown. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he seemed to have lost weight. He sat across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee he never touched. He didn't make excuses. He just apologized. "I'm so sorry, Sophia," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He admitted he had known about his mother and my father's plan for weeks, but he had been too scared, too dependent on them to say anything. "I knew it was wrong. You didn't deserve any of that. None of it." I looked at the young man in front of me and saw the genuine shame in his eyes. He wasn't a monster like them. He was just a boy who had made a cowardly choice, and I understood cowardice. I had been a coward for years, swallowing my pain and staying silent. "Thank you for saying that, Jacob," I said, my voice gentle. "I appreciate it, more than you know." I reached across the table and put my hand over his for a moment. "Just do one thing for me. Live a good life. Be a better man than he is. Don't go down their path." He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I forgave him in that moment, not for him, but for me. But I also knew, with a sad certainty, that this conversation, this apology, changed nothing. The boundary had been drawn in blood and betrayal, and it could not be undrawn. That afternoon, I returned to the house one last time to perform a final, necessary ritual. I walked upstairs to my mother's old office, which had sat mostly untouched for years. I took out my key and opened the lockbox. My lockbox. The one they had violated. I didn't just grab it and leave. I sat on the floor, and with the careful reverence of a historian handling ancient artifacts, I took everything out. I read through the letters she had sent me at basic training, her elegant cursive filling the pages with love and encouragement. I held the small silver locket, tracing the intricate floral pattern with my thumb. I looked at the faded photograph of us on the beach, her arm wrapped tightly around my skinny shoulders. I carefully placed each item, one by one, into a new, sturdy pelican case I had brought with me. A case that was waterproof, crush-proof, and secure. This was no longer just a collection of keepsakes. It was my mother's legacy, her essence, and it would not remain in this house, this toxic environment that had tarnished her memory. This was a rescue mission. I was finally taking my mother home, with me. Before I left to drive back to my own apartment near the base, I did one last thing. I took a single sheet of plain white paper and a pen. I didn't write a long, angry letter. There was no need for that anymore. My note was short, precise, and final. I placed it in the center of the kitchen table, where he would be sure to find it. It read, "William, this is the last time you will ever hear from me. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. Do not contact me again." I didn't sign it with your daughter. That relationship, like the little girl who craved his approval, was dead and buried. The note held no anger, no hatred, only the clean, quiet finality of a closed door. I walked out of that house and didn't look back. As I drove my truck out of the familiar neighborhood and headed for the highway, my eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. I didn't even glance in the rearview mirror. There was nothing back there left for me to see. Driving back towards Fort Bragg, with the Pelican case containing my mother's legacy secured on the passenger seat, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. The war was over. The boundaries were set. The ghosts were silenced. As my truck passed through the main gate, past the stern-faced MPs who gave me a sharp salute, I felt the tension of the past few weeks finally uncoil from my spine. I wasn't just returning to my job, I was coming home. The familiar rhythm of the base, the disciplined energy, the shared sense of purpose, the easy camaraderie, was the best possible balm for a wounded spirit. The guys on my team welcomed me back not with probing questions, but with backslapping hugs and terrible jokes about my relaxing vacation. They didn't need the details. They just needed to know I was okay. Sarge Miller found me later that day at the firing range. He stood beside me as I put a tight grouping in the center of a target 50 yards away. He didn't say much. He just watched for a moment, then clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Welcome home, Captain," he said, his voice laced with an unspoken understanding. Mission accomplished. That was all that needed to be said. He knew this had been one of the toughest missions of my life, fought not in a foreign desert, but in the landscape of my own past. His simple acknowledgement meant more to me than any medal. A year passed. Life found a new, quieter rhythm. The inheritance money sat in a secure account, untouched. I had no desire for a fancy car or a bigger house. The money, as my mother had intended, wasn't for luxury. It was for freedom. The freedom to choose my own path. And I finally knew what that path was. I called Kat Morgan in Charlotte. I didn't need her for a fight this time. I needed her to help me build something. Together, we established a nonprofit foundation. We called it the Elaine Morgan Beacon Fund. My mother's legacy wasn't meant to sit in a bank vault. It was meant to be a light. The Beacon Fund was designed to do just that. It provides full-ride college scholarships and pro bono legal support to the children of military families who, like me, have had to navigate the treacherous waters of domestic conflict and abuse. It was a way to honor my mother's foresight, to turn her protective legacy into a shield for others. In a way, I was getting the chance to be Elaine for a new generation of kids who needed someone in their corner. The story comes to a close on a warm spring evening at the first ever Beacon Fund Awards ceremony. It was held in a small auditorium on the campus of Fayetteville Tech. I stood at the podium in my dress uniform, looking out at the 5 inaugural recipients. They were bright, resilient, hopeful young faces, the children of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. They had already weathered storms in their young lives that many adults would never face. When I spoke, I didn't tell them my story. I didn't talk about the pain or the betrayal. That was my burden, not theirs. Instead, I shared with them the gift my mother had given me. My mother, Elaine, was a lawyer and a philosopher in her own way. I began, my voice steady and clear. She believed that the one thing we have absolute control over is not what happens to us, but how we respond. The circumstances of your past do not have to define the architecture of your future. I looked at each of them, trying to impart the one truth that had saved me. Your true strength is not measured by what you have endured. It is measured by who you choose to become, in spite of it all. This scholarship isn't a handout, it's ammunition. It's a recognition of the warrior spirit you already possess. Now, go out there and build a life that is fully and unapologetically your own. After the ceremony, as the families mingled and celebrated, Sarge, who had come to show his support, walked up beside me. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the happy chaos. "Your mother," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the young scholarship winners. "She would have been damn proud of you, Captain." I smiled. A real smile, genuine and light, free from the shadows of the past. It reached all the way to my eyes. "I know she is, Sarge," I replied. "I know she is." I looked past the auditorium doors, towards the horizon, where the last brilliant colors of sunset were fading and the first stars were beginning to appear. For the first time in a long time, the future felt like an open road, a sky full of promise. My mother had given me an inheritance of money, but she had taught me how to inherit her will. I wasn't just the keeper of her legacy anymore. I had become a warrior in my own right. Using the light she gave me to illuminate the path for others, I was, at long last, completely and truly free. And that's where my story finds its new beginning. The journey from that dark hallway to the peace I feel today was a long and difficult one, but it taught me the most important lesson of all. Our deepest wounds can often become the source of our greatest strengths. That is why this channel exists. It's a place for stories of resilience, a community for every warrior who has had to fight their own battles in silence, and a reminder that you are not alone. If my story resonated with you, subscribe and become a part of this community. Share it with someone you know who is fighting their own fight. Thank you for listening. Now go and create your own dawn.